May 12, 1945. The locomotive's journey concluded with a shudder, the abrasive grind of metal wheels against the tracks, and the occupants within the carriage leaned forward, their countenances smudged and pallid. They had been inundated with accounts of what awaited them, a tapestry woven from fragmented rumors overheard in barracks and the fervent pronouncements of officers desperate to sustain morale within a faltering Reich. Some harbored the conviction they would face immediate execution, while others envisioned a future of forced subterranean labor. A pervasive dread of violation and perpetual hunger was shared by nearly all. Their military attire, once crisp and presentable, had become disheveled, their footwear showed signs of significant wear, and their hair was bound in rudimentary knots. They were warriors, dispossessed of arms, auxiliary personnel adrift from the conflict, women bereft of a nation. As the train doors creaked open, an influx of air, unmarred by the acrid scent of smoke and metal that had permeated their existence since the capitulation, flooded the carriage. A young woman, appearing no more than 24 years of age, her sharp cheekbones accentuated by emaciation, was the first to descend. She drew her worn coat more tightly around herself, as if this simple gesture could erect a shield against potential indignity. The landscape surrounding her was one of profound stillness, flat and remarkably pristine. Wooden fencing stretched toward the horizon. Gleaming barbed wire, precise and geometric in its configuration, caught the sunlight. Yet there were no shouts, no menacing canine growls. American sentinels, clad in immaculate uniforms, maintained a posture of composed detachment. Their rifles, held with an air of casual efficiency, seemed less like instruments of threat and more like utilitarian tools. The pervasive silence itself was unsettling. She steeled herself for an onslaught of harshness. Then it arrived. A fragrance. It drifted on the breeze, an ethereal echo of a different existence, warm, unctuous, and unmistakably rich. Bacon, its tantalizing aroma sizzling. She froze, as did the women behind her. It seemed utterly inconceivable, almost sacrilegious. Bacon was a word relegated to the realm of memory, to the quiet mornings preceding rationing, to households where fathers still returned with their wages and children still played without the incessant wail of air raid sirens. To inhale its scent at the threshold of confinement was akin to hearing joyous laughter amidst the somber stillness of a graveyard. Her stomach churned in a violent protest against its own gnawing emptiness. She recalled their final sustenance in Germany, a watery broth diluted with turnips and a stale bread that disintegrated into dust. She had consumed it hastily, cognizant that her younger brother, if he still drew breath amidst the devastation of Leipzig, might not even possess that meager fare. And here the Americans were preparing pork for captives. A wave of dizziness washed over her, a complex admixture of fury, shame, and a reluctant, nascent longing. The guards motioned for them to assemble into lines. Their voices, though firm, lacked any trace of cruelty. One even attempted a phrase in German, albeit imperfectly. "Bitte schnell." The women complied, each measured step accompanied by the intensifying perfume of breakfast. For some, the sensory assault was unbearable. One woman murmured under her breath, denouncing the Americans for their perceived mockery, for flaunting such opulence. Another began to weep silently, her hands trembling against the fabric of her skirt. Yet, despite their apprehension, none could resist the involuntary act of inhalation. The aroma evolved into an irresistible lure, drawing together fragments of memory and the gnawing pangs of hunger into a single, disorienting sensation. Within the confines of the camp, the reality that unfolded possessed an almost theatrical peculiarity. The communal shelters were constructed of wood, sturdy and well-maintained, furnished with straw-filled mattresses arranged in neat rows. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Buckets brimming with water stood readily accessible for ablutions. While it was no opulent dwelling, Compared to the basements and the skeletal remains of incinerated structures that had served as their recent abodes, it appeared deliberately ordered. One woman whispered that it bore a resemblance to her boarding school days. Although her tone was tinged with bitterness, the words carried the subtle potential for solace. The young woman, the one of 24 years, found herself gazing towards the communal dining hall, from whose chimneys tendrils of smoke ascended. Through the open doorways, she caught fleeting glimpses of trays being meticulously prepared with plates. Not the common tin cups or rudimentary buckets, but actual plates. Her throat tightened. She had anticipated harsh treatment, verbal abuse, a complete stripping of her dignity. Instead, what she encountered was a quiet efficiency, a system of discipline that eschewed brutality. She could not bring herself to trust it. None of them could. It had to be an elaborate deception, a performance designed to lull them into a false sense of security before the true torment began. As they were finally ushered into the hall, the auditory sensation was the first to assail them. The sharp crackle and persistent sizzle of fat rendered in cast-iron pans. Individuals attired in aprons, yes, uniformed personnel in aprons, stood behind lengthy counters, deftly turning strips of bacon with metal tongs. The air shimmered with the heat emanating from the cooking, carrying the mingled scents of salt and smoke, underscored by a quality of almost musical normalcy. The women advanced tentatively, their gazes darting, unable to reconcile their profound apprehension with the sheer absurdity of the scene. Plates were dispensed to them. Upon these plates rested bread, potatoes, and, to their profound astonishment, 1 or 2 strips of bacon. The 24-year-old woman stared intently at her own portion, her hand trembling. Her thoughts drifted to her mother, who had perished in an aerial bombardment 2 winters prior, clutching a faded photograph of her father, a man who had never returned from the Eastern Front. She recollected the gaunt children she had witnessed begging in the desolate streets of Dresden, their skeletal hands extended in desperate plea for meager scraps of coal. And now, in the custody of their adversaries, she was presented with bacon. Her chest ached with a profound sense of bewilderment. She felt an urge to refuse, to spit in defiance, to demonstrate that she could not be so easily subdued. However, her own physiology betrayed her resolve. She raised the strip of bacon to her lips and took a bite. The sensation was overwhelming, saline, fatty, warm. It filled her mouth with a torrent of memories, shame, and a relief so potent it felt akin to profound sorrow. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and involuntary. She consumed the food with haste, almost with desperation, before her capacity for rational thought could reassert itself. Others followed suit. Some wept openly as they ate. Others chewed deliberately, with an almost reverent slowness, as if fearful that the sustenance would inexplicably vanish. Still others pushed their plates aside, their pride unable to reconcile with their ravenous hunger. Yet, for a brief interval, the room was enveloped in a hushed quietude, broken only by the sounds of mastication. A solitary American guard, perhaps in his early 30s, leaned against the doorway, observing the scene. His uniform was impeccably pressed, his expression impassive. However, when one of the women looked up, their eyes met, and he offered a subtle shrug, as if to convey, "It is merely breakfast." That understated gesture carried a weight far greater than any weapon. It hinted at a world where adversaries were not inherently monstrous, where captors could extend acts of benevolence. It initiated a profound disruption within the ingrained mythology that had been instilled in these women. Upon the conclusion of the meal, the women were escorted back to their assigned quarters. The 24-year-old woman lay down on her bunk, her gaze fixed upon the wooden ceiling. The taste of the bacon still lingered on her tongue. She felt both lighter and heavier simultaneously, as though an immense burden had been shifted, though not entirely lifted. She remained uncertain whether she could place her trust in the Americans, whether this was genuine generosity or a calculated stratagem, but one truth resonated with absolute certainty. Her perception of the enemy had been irrevocably altered by a single meal. That evening, as a profound silence settled over the camp, she listened to the faint, rhythmic sounds of guards on patrol beyond the perimeter. No audible commands, no agitated barking, only the steady cadence of boots upon the earth. She closed her eyes, but sleep proved elusive. The bacon had satisfied her physical hunger, yet it had also stirred a deep internal disquiet. If the enemy possessed the capacity for such order, for sustenance, even for what resembled compassion, then what other revelations awaited her during her captivity? The question burned with an intensity that eclipsed her hunger. As dawn began to break, the faint aroma returned, carried on the morning breeze through the camp. She inhaled deeply, understanding with a sudden clarity that the conflict she had entered was no longer defined by armies or territorial boundaries, but by the very essence of belief. She had been conditioned to anticipate malevolence. Instead, she had been met with bacon. It was not an act of absolution, nor an overture of friendship, but it was something far more insidious to the certainties she held. It was tangible evidence of an alternative reality. And the most profoundly disquieting truth of all was this: breakfast was merely the prologue. The women soon discovered that the most significant struggle within the camp transcended the clatter of rifles or the clash of fists. It was waged through ideologies that subtly undermined the foundations of their ingrained beliefs. For years, their lives had been dictated by the relentless drumbeat of propaganda. Public posters had shrieked of American barbarity, depicting men as little more than avaricious mercenaries. Radio broadcasts had painted vivid portraits of savage soldiers, men who would inflict fire, humiliation, and desecration upon any German unfortunate enough to fall into their clutches. Even women in administrative roles or stationed in observation towers, far removed from the direct hostilities, had internalized these images, using them as a form of psychological armor. They braced themselves for a level of brutality that would, at the very least, lend a grim logic to their pervasive fear. However, the initial weeks within the camp began to erode the credibility of these deeply ingrained narratives. Though the Americans communicated in broken German, their tone remained measured, their discipline unwavering. Directives were issued concisely, crisply, yet devoid of malice. The guards treated the women not as prey to be hunted, but as a responsibility to be managed. In place of hunger, they were provided with regular sustenance. In lieu of squalor, they were offered soap and water. Instead of overt degradation, they were subjected to a rigid adherence to routine. Each such discovery served to destabilize them more profoundly than any shouted insult could have achieved. The 24-year-old woman found herself increasingly preoccupied by this stark contrast. She vividly recalled the impassioned lectures delivered in training halls where officers had vehemently asserted that capture invariably led to a fate far more dreadful than death. She remembered the hushed warnings exchanged among older women who claimed the Americans carried knives for sport and relished the act of severing throats. Now, she found herself walking past meticulously maintained kitchens where cooks in their aprons stirred vast cauldrons of potatoes, their expressions reflecting boredom rather than cruelty. She detected the aroma of coffee, genuine coffee, not the ersatz concoction of burnt barley that had been their sole recourse for years, and she heard the metallic scraping of serving trays. She could not ascertain which was the greater torment, the physical emptiness in her stomach or the internal conflict raging within her mind. The propaganda that had served as her compass had become utterly unreliable, its needles spinning wildly. The other women experienced a similar disquiet. In the stillness of the night, lying on their thinly padded mattresses, they spoke in hushed tones, attempting to reconcile rumor with the unfolding reality. One woman admitted she had anticipated being subjected to sexual assault the moment they disembarked from the train. Yet, not a single guard had laid a hand upon her. Another confessed she could not cease her fixation on the bread, so white and soft, entirely devoid of sawdust. Bread, she reasoned, was supposed to be a scarce commodity across the continent. Yet here it appeared in abundance, replenished without fanfare. To acknowledge their relief felt fraught with peril, akin to a betrayal of their families enduring hardship back home. Nevertheless, the evidence was undeniable. The camp's inherent order was meticulously constructed, almost theatrically normalized. A strict roll call was conducted at dawn. Some women were assigned tasks, while others were given lighter duties. Inspections were conducted not with the threat of whips or fists, but with the methodical review of checklists. The guards themselves appeared remarkably youthful, barely older than the prisoners, their faces smooth, their boots polished to a high sheen. They carried themselves with a confidence derived not from intimidation, but from an innate certainty. For the German women, who had endured years of pervasive scarcity and constant fear, this air of assuredness was as alien as it was deeply infuriating. The 24-year-old woman began to observe subtle details that resonated with her. She witnessed a guard sharing a cigarette with a comrade, their quiet laughter suggesting that the war was a distant inconvenience rather than a cataclysmic rupture of nations. She perceived the faint strains of music emanating from a gramophone within the officers' quarters, jaunty, playful, utterly indifferent to the vicissitudes of victory or defeat. She observed the removal of food waste from the kitchens. Discarded remnants of bacon fat were tossed aside, and her chest tightened at the thought of the children in Hamburg or Leipzig who would have fought ferociously for those very scraps. The true cruelty lay not in physical blows or enforced deprivation, but in the unbearable testament to the enemy's capacity for abundance while her own people suffered from starvation. Moments of poignant irony presented themselves with jarring frequency. On one occasion, as the women were forming an orderly queue for their midday meal, a guard attempted to utter a German phrase. His pronunciation was so mangled that an involuntary burst of laughter escaped from several women before they quickly stifled it, overcome by a sense of shame. The guard merely grinned, unfazed, a silent acknowledgement that the ability to laugh at an American and emerge unscathed was, in itself, a significant fissure in the fabric of their known world. On another instance, a woman fumbled her tray, and a young American, without hesitation, knelt to assist her in collecting the spilled contents. He offered no scorn, he simply offered a shrug, uttered a brief phrase in his native tongue, and returned to his post. She remained rooted to the spot, as if she had caught a fleeting glimpse of a reality where compassion could transcend the physical barrier of barbed wire. Yet an undercurrent of suspicion persisted. Surely, they reasoned amongst themselves, this was merely a temporary reprieve. The genuine cruelty, they assumed, would inevitably manifest later, once their defenses had been sufficiently weakened. Some women resolutely refused to consume the bacon, tearing it into fragments and leaving it untouched, a symbolic act to assert their refusal to be swayed. Others discreetly secreted bread, stowing crusts in hidden pockets, fearing that the present abundance was ephemeral. The 24-year-old woman attempted to strike a balance between her pride and her instinct for survival, reminding herself that accepting sustenance did not equate to accepting defeat. Nevertheless, each bite seemed to carry the taste of betrayal, a betrayal of the regime that had so grievously deceived her, and a betrayal of the civilians still enduring hardship across Germany. In the quiet of the night, the camp's lights cast a steady glow against the enveloping darkness. Beyond the perimeter fence lay a continent in ruins, yet within the confines of the compound there existed order, routine, and an undeniable sense of safety. It was a paradox that defied their attempts at comprehension. When letters home were eventually permitted, they were penned with meticulous care, omitting any details that might invite disbelief. The thought of conveying the truth, "We are eating better here than you are in the outside world," felt audacious, akin to treason or outright madness. Yet, it was the unvarnished reality. The Americans themselves appeared remarkably indifferent to the profound impact of their actions. For them, the act of providing adequate provisions for prisoners was likely a matter of policy, a procedural requirement dictated by the Geneva Convention. For the women, however, it constituted a revelation that plunged the dagger of doubt deeper into their convictions. If their captors adhered to principles of fairness, if they offered both food and shelter, then the deeply ingrained image of America as a barbaric adversary began to crumble. And if that specific image faltered, what other foundational tenets of their belief system might also prove to be falsehoods? The 24-year-old woman found herself contemplating her brother once more. Had he succumbed to his injuries while clinging to the conviction that Americans were inherently monstrous? Had he met his end fighting against specters while she, at this very moment, was consuming their rations and resting under their protection? The thought left her chest hollow. She could not articulate this nascent realization aloud, not even to the women by her side, but already the internal conflict that waged within her mind had become more formidable than the external war she had left behind. Thus, the days transitioned, each meal serving as another stark reminder that the world they had once known was irrevocably lost. The bacon transcended its role as mere sustenance. It became a potent weapon, a powerful symbol, and a profound challenge. It compelled them to scrutinize not only their adversaries, but also their own deeply held beliefs. Some women hardened their resolve further, vowing to remain unyielding, refusing to offer even a hint of a smile, irrespective of the escalating orderliness of the camp. Others, hesitantly, began to soften, recognizing that survival necessitated more than mere defiance. The 24-year-old woman wavered precariously between these two extremes, torn between the dictates of her hunger and the dictates of her pride, between the sting of shame and the unexpected relief. One evening, as the sun descended beyond the enclosing wire, she sat in solitude, observing the tendrils of smoke curling from the kitchen chimneys. The aroma of supper drifted across the compound, the scent of bacon once again mingling with the more subdued fragrances of potatoes and bread. She closed her eyes, allowing the olfactory sensation to wash over her, and whispered a name she had not uttered since the devastating bombing of Leipzig, her brother's name. For the first time, she perceived the stark truth bearing down upon her with the sharpness of a blade. Perhaps the most profound act of cruelty was not the physical subjugation inflicted by the Americans, but their conspicuous absence of it. And within the unsettling embrace of that unexpected kindness lay a profound lesson she was not yet prepared to confront. When the bell signaled the commencement of the subsequent meal, she rose along with the others, her stomach tightening with anticipation. However, what awaited them in the unfolding days would not only test their physical hunger, but would also fundamentally challenge their deeply ingrained beliefs. For the Americans were orchestrating something far more insidious than mere culinary provisions. They were preparing to introduce ideas. The mornings commenced with the resonant clang of the bell and the rhythmic scrape of boots across the exercise yard. But gradually, another sound began to permeate the established rhythm of camp life. It was the gentle murmur of voices engaged in earnest discussion over books, the soft scratch of pencils against paper, and the hesitant cadence of English words painstakingly coaxed from German tongues. The Americans had not been content with merely nourishing the bodies of their captives. They harbored a desire to cultivate their minds. Initially, the women reacted to the circulating rumors with bitter amusement. Education within the confines of barbed wire enclosures seemed preposterous. It was, they suspected, merely another ploy designed to erode their spirit. However, the guards soon unlocked a spacious hut, cleared the interior space, and arranged wooden benches in orderly rows. A chalkboard appeared, showing signs of wear, but perfectly serviceable. Boxes of books followed, many bearing pages yellowed with age, others still exuding the fresh scent of newly printed ink. What had begun with a simple offering of bacon was now progressing to the complex construction of sentences. The 24-year-old woman entered the makeshift classroom with a palpable reluctance, her arms clasped protectively across her chest as if to ward off an unseen threat. Around her, the other women shuffled with a similar air of suspicion, their gazes fixed on the chalkboard where an American sergeant had meticulously inscribed a single, potent word in chalk: freedom. He underlined it twice, then offered a smile, as if the very concept itself served as nourishment. The women exchanged wary glances, unsettled by the profound implications of a word that seemed to demand so much of them. The lessons commenced with rudimentary English phrases, which often twisted awkwardly on German tongues. "Good morning. How are you? My name is—" The sergeant exaggerated his pronunciations, his voice imbued with a near playful tone, coaxing them to repeat. Some mumbled the words with tightly clenched jaws, while others giggled uncontrollably at their own mispronunciations. The 24-year-old woman maintained a stern expression, but as she whispered the phrases, she felt them register strangely on her tongue, a lightness that contrasted sharply with the guttural weight of her native language. This sensation was profoundly disorienting. Beyond mere vocabulary, the Americans introduced visual media. One afternoon, the women were herded into the mess hall, where a projector whirred to life. The screen flickered with images of ravaged cities, the stark visages of corpses clad in striped uniforms, and emaciated figures stumbling through gates of liberation. The women observed in absolute silence, their faces drained of color, their breaths shallow. Some whispered denials, while others turned away in distress. The 24-year-old woman felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had wanted to believe, or perhaps had actively chosen to believe, that such accounts were exaggerated. Yet, the unblinking lens of the camera did not flinch. The unvarnished truth unspooled before them, grainy and undeniable. The bacon had been their initial shock. This was their second, far more somber revelation. The Americans did not resort to shouting or demanding confessions. They simply allowed the images to imprint themselves upon the women's minds. Then they seamlessly transitioned back to their lessons, to their books, conveying an unspoken message. The world you once knew has ceased to exist. Now, endeavor to learn the language of another. Some women responded to the films with increased resistance, retreating into a resolute silence. Others, however, leaned forward, their hunger not solely for sustenance, but for knowledge, as if education itself represented a ladder ascending from the ruins of their former lives. Statistical data began to filter into their daily existence, much like background noise. Over 370,000 German prisoners of war were held by the United States, a significant portion of whom were women dispersed across Europe and America. Numerous camps maintained libraries stocked with novels, historical accounts, and even poetry. For women who had witnessed books being consumed by flames in public squares mere years prior, this sudden abundance of written material was both bewildering and intoxicating. The 24-year-old woman picked up a well-worn copy of Huckleberry Finn. While she did not grasp every nuance, the rhythm of the prose carried her along. The mischievous spirit of the boy's journey felt strange and undeniably compelling. She read in secret during the night, concealing the book beneath her blanket, as if it were contraband rather than an offering. Not every instructional session was gentle. On one occasion, an American officer requested that the class compose a written account of their childhoods, in English if possible, in German if not. The women bent over their papers, their pencils scratching out memories of farms, bustling cities, mothers baking bread, fathers returning from their labors, and school days now irrevocably blurred by the ravages of war. When the officer collected the pages, he read several aloud, his voice, even with its distinct accent, carrying weight. The 24-year-old woman's narrative was among those selected. She heard her own words, halting and imperfect, echoed back to her in the voice of the enemy. For a fleeting moment, she felt exposed, stripped bare, yet within that vulnerability lay something unforeseen. She realized that the Americans were not attempting to mock them, but to truly listen. Humor manifested itself at unexpected junctures. During one English drill, the sergeant attempted to teach the word bacon. The room erupted in laughter before he had even completed writing the letters. The women exchanged knowing glances, their shoulders shaking. For a few brief moments, the presence of the barbed wire seemed to dissipate. and the sheer absurdity of the situation, the enemy instructing them on how to articulate the very food that had so profoundly unsettled their souls, became an overwhelming force. The sergeant, with chalk dust adorning his fingers, grinned and allowed the laughter to subside naturally. Nevertheless, an undercurrent of tension permeated every aspect of their existence. Each lesson served as a stark reminder that the Americans were not merely attending to their physical needs, but were actively engaged in reshaping their mental landscapes. The 24-year-old woman wrestled with a pervasive sense of guilt whenever she found herself enjoying the educational sessions. Her thoughts would invariably drift to her brother, interred beneath heaps of debris or earth, who would never have the chance to peruse an American publication, nor would he ever experience the vibrant strains of jazz emanating from a gramophone. She also remembered her mother, who had passed away clinging to the unwavering belief that eventual victory was still attainable. She questioned whether she was betraying their memories by occupying a bench, diligently reciting foreign linguistic constructs and allowing herself to be swayed by narratives and melodies. Yet, the alternative, to staunch her hearing, to retreat into a realm of absolute quietude, felt akin to a different form of demise. The camp's periodicals, meticulously crafted by inmates under strict observation, evolved into yet another arena of contention. The articles within these publications delved into matters of politics, philosophical inquiries, and the intrinsic essence of democratic principles. The women read them with a palpable sense of caution, their fingers often smudged with ink, their eyes widened by concepts that had previously been deemed strictly forbidden. To engage in contemplation, to pose challenging questions, even to harbor reservations. These actions gradually transformed into subtle acts of defiance against the lingering shadows of the past. Upon finishing, some individuals would rend the newspapers into fragments, apprehensive of the emotional upheaval the written words might provoke. Others, conversely, would fold them with meticulous care, preserving them as cherished keepsakes. Day by day, the 24-year-old found herself increasingly captivated by the subtle, ongoing evolution of intellectual growth. She began to offer greetings to the guards in English, testing the pronunciation of these new phrases on her palate. She would often linger near the modest structure housing the library, her fingertips tracing the worn spines of the books. On occasion, she would find herself softly humming a melody from a cinematic presentation, though she would swiftly stifle the tune upon receiving disapproving glances from those around her. It was as if the very wire mesh that encircled the compound not only imprisoned her physical being, but also constrained her convictions, and each instructional period served to create a minuscule aperture through which a new potentiality could cautiously seep. However, these educational interludes were not devoid of emotional distress. When another film screening was presented, this time depicting American servicemen distributing provisions to communities that had recently been liberated, she experienced a profound sense of emptiness. She vividly recalled German youngsters desperately seeking sustenance, and her own gnawing hunger during the arduous trek to their place of confinement. She came to the stark realization that, while she was being provided with sustenance behind the barbed wire, her own people were enduring the pangs of starvation beyond its confines. This stark disparity inflicted a deep wound, leaving her in a state of perpetual unease. The American personnel did not solicit any expressions of gratitude. They made no demands for unwavering allegiance. They simply persisted, day after day, in their endeavors to provide sustenance, impart knowledge, and showcase their endeavors. It was an unyielding approach, possessing a patience that surpassed any physical coercion, and an unsettling impact far more profound than any overt act of violence. The 24-year-old began to grasp that their most potent instrument was not their weaponry, but their unshakable conviction that enlightenment itself held the power to dismantle the constraints of prior circumstances. One evening, as the setting sun cast a deep crimson hue across the enclosure, she tarried outside the humble classroom hut. In her hands, she held a notebook filled with her nascent attempts at English composition, her penmanship faltering yet imbued with a resolute spirit. She raised her gaze towards the imposing barbed wire, its edges catching the fading light and appearing to glow. Beyond its reach lay a landscape of devastation that she could scarcely conceive of returning to. Within lay educational experiences that she was yet unwilling to admit she desired. For the inaugural occasion, her contemplation shifted from the actions the Americans might take against her to the profound transformations they were already instigating within her. And when the resonant sound of the bell once more beckoned them back to the hut for another session, she faltered. Her feet felt leaden, her spirit divided between a desire for defiance and an undeniable curiosity. But as she took a step forward, she recognized that the nature of the conflict had once again undergone a significant alteration. No longer defined by armed confrontation, nor even by the manipulation of information, it had now become a profound struggle for the very core of her imagination. And the subsequent presentation that the Americans had planned would penetrate far deeper than mere linguistic acquisition or the contents of a book. The gates swung open with the same metallic lament that had once swallowed them whole. However, this time, it released them into a world they could barely recognize. Months, and in some instances even years, had elapsed during their confinement, and the women who emerged were fundamentally altered from those who had initially inhaled the scent of bacon with a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. The 24-year-old adjusted the modest bundle she carried, containing a few garments, a notebook filled with tentative English phrases, and a book gifted by a compassionate guard. She attempted to prepare herself. She had endured the ordeal of captivity, but the prospect of survival beyond the perimeter fence felt considerably less assured. The train that conveyed them back toward Germany was densely packed, its rhythmic clatter echoing across landscapes marred by an unnerving silence. Villages lay in ruins, their chimneys rising like fractured teeth from mounds of ash. Bridges, twisted and mangled, spanned rivers, their skeletal steel structures glinting under the sun. The women pressed their faces against the glass panes, desperately searching for any semblance of familiarity, only to encounter an overwhelming scene of utter destruction. One of them murmured that the Americans had treated them with greater kindness than their own war-ravaged cities ever could. Another softly remarked that perhaps their imprisonment had, in retrospect, been a form of disguised benevolence. No one offered any counter-arguments. Their thoughts were burdened by lingering images of the ordered meals they had partaken in, while across the vast ocean their families had endured long queues for meager portions of turnips and coarse black bread. When the train eventually halted, the 24-year-old disembarked into a scene of utter pandemonium. Crowds surged, their faces gaunt, their eyes vacant. Children, their cheeks sunken and their voices faint with hunger, clung to their mothers' skirts. She remained frozen, her heart pounding, overwhelmed by the cacophony of desperation. For a fleeting moment, she yearned for the structured order of the camp, the guaranteed provision of meals, the predictable chime of the bells. A wave of shame washed over her at the mere contemplation. Freedom was supposed to possess a sweet flavor. Instead, it tasted of cinders and a profound emptiness. Her hometown was no more. Where neat rows of residential buildings had once stood, now only a sprawling expanse of rubble with bricks scattered like fallen bones remained. She located the street where her family's dwelling had been, only to discover it reduced to a flat ruin. A neighbor, walking with a noticeable limp and a shock of gray hair, informed her that her brother had never returned from the conflict. Her father had perished at Stalingrad. Her mother had been crushed by falling beams during an aerial bombardment. These pronouncements, delivered without preamble, nonetheless hollowed her chest as if she had been struck by artillery fire. She stood amidst the desolate remnants, clutching her meager belongings, the scent of bacon from her memories rising with agonizing clarity. To have been so well fed while her lineage starved, was this survival, or a profound act of betrayal? The ensuing days unfolded as a peculiar period of suspended animation. She found lodging with distant relatives who regarded her with palpable suspicion. They had endured the rigors of hunger, the biting cold, and the relentless bombardment. She, conversely, had been a captive, yet she had been provided with sustenance. Her cheeks retained a healthy hue, and her physique was more robust than theirs. One relative inquired pointedly, "What recompense did you offer the Americans in return?" She found herself unable to articulate a response. How could she possibly convey that their survival had been extended in the form of order, nourishment, even access to literature, all without any form of coercion or degradation? Her silence only served to deepen their existing mistrust. On the streets, she overheard disparaging remarks concerning those who had returned. Some asserted that the Americans had subjected them to psychological manipulation. Others scoffed, suggesting they had grown plump during their confinement. Children would stare at her, their gazes filled with resentment, their bellies distended from malnutrition. She deliberately avoided their eyes, as each glance seemed to carry the weight of unspoken accusation. At night, she lay awake, listening to the restless movements of her relatives, wondering if they resented her presence, if they harbored the belief that she was concealing shame beneath a facade of resilience. Yet, in the profound stillness, the lessons she had received resurfaced in her mind. She recalled the word inscribed on the chalkboard, freedom, and the cinematic presentations that had irrevocably shattered her illusions. She remembered the narrative passages of Huckleberry Finn, the uninhibited joy of a boy adrift on a raft, the sheer audacity of a story unbound by fear. These recollections stood in stark contrast to the pervasive desolation surrounding her. The Germany to which she had returned was not merely physically devastated, but also deeply wounded in its very spirit. Neighbors whispered of retribution, of vengeance, of treachery. The 24-year-old listened intently, but within her, a different voice began to assert itself with increasing prominence, a voice she had first encountered in the humble confines of the classroom hut. Nevertheless, a persistent sense of guilt continued to cast its shadow over her. Each time the aroma of cooking food reached her, a thin cabbage broth or the bitter scent of scorched barley coffee, her mind would betray her with a vivid recollection of bacon sizzling in an American pan. The contrast was utterly unbearable. She felt an overwhelming urge to share this experience, to articulate its surreal nature to someone, but she intuitively understood how such a confession would be perceived. It would sound arrogant, ungrateful, even treasonous, and so she kept the revelation locked away within herself. The taste of bacon transformed, evolving from a mere memory into a profound secret, a burden far too heavy to confess. One afternoon, she happened upon a gathering of people assembled around a truck, from which aid workers were distributing cans of food. Children jostled for position, women extended their emaciated arms. She stood at the periphery, clutching her bundle, until a man in a foreign uniform placed a can into her hand. She stared at the label. It declared American. The sight caused a tightness in her throat. The war had concluded. Yet here again, the former adversary was providing sustenance to her people. She felt an overwhelming impulse to scream, to hurl the can into the surrounding rubble, but her hands seemed incapable of releasing their grip. She carried it home, where her relatives eagerly opened it, scraping its contents into a pot, their voices filled with praise for the Americans' apparent abundance. She remained silent, but within her, a subtle shift was occurring. The enemy had provided for her once during her captivity. Now, they were providing for her people amidst their utter devastation. The recurring pattern was undeniable. As the weeks progressed, she resumed writing in her notebook. She filled its pages with rudimentary English sentences, fragmented recollections, and persistent questions that she could not suppress. At times, her writings focused on her brother, at other times on her mother, but frequently they detailed her experiences in the camp, the distinct smell of bacon, the reticence of the guards, the chalk dust on the sergeant's fingers. Her relatives discovered her one day, frowning at the foreign script. "Why squander ink on their tongue?" they inquired. She lowered her gaze, but inwardly she understood the reason. It offered her a connection to a world that had not been reduced to mere ruins. Slowly, she came to the realization that her period of confinement had not truly ended when she passed through the camp gates. It persisted within her, manifesting as a profound conflict between her ingrained memories and the stark realities she now faced, a battle between pervasive propaganda and her own lived experiences. She was physically liberated, but her thoughts remained ensnared, torn between an imposed loyalty to the departed and the irrefutable truth of what she had witnessed. The bacon, the books, the films. They had not only nourished her, but had fundamentally transformed her. She could not revert to a state of ignorance, regardless of how intensely she might wish to. One evening, she ventured once more to the desolate remains of her former street. The sun descended, casting elongated shadows across the broken brickwork. She settled onto a stone, opened her notebook, and inscribed a solitary sentence in English. "I am still alive." The words appeared delicate on the page, yet they resonated with a strength far exceeding any uniform she had ever worn. She closed the book, pressing it firmly against her chest, and allowed the prevailing silence to envelop her. The lingering taste of bacon persisted, no longer merely a culinary memory, but a potent symbol, a dual emblem of both solace and torment. It served as irrefutable evidence of a world that existed beyond the confines of the barbed wire. A world where adversaries offered sustenance rather than inflicted deprivation, where spoken words superseded harsh commands, and where written texts supplanted oppressive decrees. This was not an act of clemency, nor was it forgiveness, but rather something far more potent, far more perilous, the nascent stirrings of possibility. And as she gazed upon the ravaged remnants of her city, she comprehended that her struggle for survival was not the conclusion of her conflict. It was, in fact, the commencement of a new one. A battle waged not with instruments of war, but with the weight of remembrance, the burden of guilt, and the fragile hope that humanity might, in time, be reconstructed from the very ashes of its devastation. She rose, tucking the notebook beneath her arm, her gait measured yet purposeful. The surrounding streets echoed with the sounds of widespread hunger and pervasive bitterness. Yet, within her, the persistent, sizzling resonance of bacon refused to fade. It whispered of inherent contradictions, of unsettling truths, and of future possibilities yet to be inscribed. And as the shroud of night descended, she grasped with a clarity that was simultaneously terrifying and profoundly liberating. The external war had indeed ended, but the true contest, the fundamental struggle for meaning, had only just begun.